Hi, I'm Anna Hoffman, and welcome to this episode of Data Exposed Live. I am excited to have you joining us today from wherever you're streaming in from, whether it's YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, somewhere else, or Learn TV. That's the big one, Learn TV. And if you're joining us from the Microsoft Reactor, we're also happy to have you joining us here today. Now, today we have a very special topic. We're going to be doing an Azure Data Factory Power Hour. Now, some of you might have joined us for the Power Hour that we did for Azure Data Studio back in July. It was a lot of fun. It's really fast. The idea is to essentially bring on a bunch of folks to demo a bunch of new things related to Azure Data Factory, or what we did in July, Azure Data Studio. And it's a time, because you have all these great experts on screen with you, it's a great time to get your questions answered. So any questions you have about Azure Data Factory, we have 5 or 6 experts standing by to be able to answer those questions live or using the chat. So wherever you're streaming from, go ahead and type your questions in, type your comments in, say hi to us. Let's see if anyone said anything yet. Someone has said, is this session happening now? And it is. So you can see this is an example of how you get your question featured up on the screen. Now, like I mentioned, we're going to be talking today about Azure Data Factory. And for this wonderful occasion, I am wearing my, you can't see it that well, but I'm wearing my Azure Data Factory Make It Happen hero sweatshirt. Any excuse to wear a hoodie, I'm all for it. But with all that rambling aside, I'm going to bring up the lead for the Azure Data Factory team, Hyong. So hi, Hyong, how are you?
Hey, hi Anna. Thanks for having us on the show.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to have you all on the show. Before we get into some of the updates, which is another exciting thing we're doing today, can you just tell us like a little bit about your team and Azure Data Factory for folks who might not be familiar?
Yeah, sounds good. So Azure Data Factory, right, is an industry-leading ETL tool or data integration service on Azure, right? And it moves data between on-premises, the cloud, any cloud, as well as SaaS providers, right? And it allows you to transform this data at scale to land this in a target data store of your choice, right? And it could be Synapse, data warehouse for that matter. And as part of the Azure Data Factory team, we deliver data integration experience both in Azure Data Factory, but at the same time, if you are using Azure Synapse Analytics, you'll notice Synapse pipelines and data flows, right? That is the Azure Data Factory data integration experience, if you will, right? Surfacing up in Azure Synapse Analytics. And that allows anyone that's using Azure Synapse Analytics, right, to have the same kind of power and scale, right, that you have expect from an enterprise data integration tool, and being able to land this data into the Synapse data warehouse, if you will, right?
Awesome, cool. Yeah, Azure Data Factory is an awesome tool. I love to use it because it's so easy to use and it's very effective at doing things like loading data, among many other things that it's possible to help folks do. Now today, we're going to be talking about some new things. Actually, I think you saved some announcements specifically for this episode. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. In fact, one of the things that excites us, and this is kudos to the entire ADF engineering team as well as the PM team, is that every single month, there's a huge amount of product innovation that's been pushed out of the door. And today we're excited to share some of these exciting updates with you as well, right? And it's going to be complemented with a lot of demos that will get you to see it in action.
Awesome, great. So we have the updates up here, but I think we want to dive into them a little bit closer. So can you tell us like how people can find these updates?
Sure. So you'll see the link on the screen, right? Today, every single month, for all the updates that we make in Azure Data Factory or in Azure Synapse Analytics, right, we push it up to this Azure Docs page, which says what's new in Azure Data Factory. And every single month, you'll see actually a whole broad of product innovations happening across, data movement, data flow, orchestration capabilities, and so on and so forth. And so we get a lot of questions, whether it's on customer calls or on briefings or on live shows like this. Where do we find the product updates? And here at one single place, you can find all the updates that has happened over the past many months. And hopefully that will help you keep up to date with what the service is doing. But at the same time, right, if you have any feedback, feedback is key to, us continuously improving the service, and we'd love to hear from you, right?
Awesome. Yeah, no, I think it's great that you all keep this up to date. I think, let's get right into some of these updates. I know we have a bunch and a bunch of demos.
Sounds good. Yeah. So I think if you look across the September 2021 updates, right, on CI/CD, of course, we have expanded some of the CI/CD capabilities today that allows you to even create a new Git branch based on any branch, right, in your Git repository. And I think that's one of the top asks that we've been hearing for a while, and we are so glad that we are able to get it out the door. And across data movement and data flows, and you'll see some of this in action later on, right? Whether it's adding new additional data sources that we can connect to and to bring data, but at the same time to be able to support, performance improvements like parallel copy for Azure database for PostgreSQL. On the data flow front, you'll see us adding a lot of enhancement into, how we connect to ADL Gen 2, but also being able to execute pre and post processing commands, if you will. The other top ask that we hear a lot is that I've created an integration runtime, but I really want to edit the data flow properties on it. And in this case, of course, now we actually make it editable without having you to create a new one. TTL setting for Azure Synapse is top of mind. Anyone that is used and love Azure Data Factory, when they start using Azure Synapse Analytics, they'll say, well, why can't I get TTL? And for those, who does not live in the world of acronyms, if you will, TTL stands for time to live, and it's essentially a setting that allows you to control how long the integration runtime, which is see as the compute that does the actual work for behind the scene, right, to stay alive, so that you can then be able to reuse it across multiple sequential data flows, if you will. On the integration runtime front, one thing that we're really excited to share, and you also see demos on it, is managed virtual network, or managed VNet in short, is generally available. Now, this is a long time coming, like it was in public preview for a while. And, we get a lot of feedback to say, well, we love the kind of security promises that comes from a managed virtual network without me having to tinker with any of this networking kind of settings, if you will. And Data Factory underneath the hood takes care of it for you. When is it going to GA? Now, we are so excited to share that it's now officially GA. And then the last piece is really some of the things around orchestration. When you have long-running pipelines and you want to be alerted if the elapsed time is longer than what you expect, so that you can come in to investigate it, to figure out what is wrong before something goes wrong. Now this is also available as well, right? So in short, what you see really quickly across the September update is a very balanced set of product innovation across all Azure Data Factory product areas. And what you see in Azure Data Factory, you get it in Azure Synapse Analytics as well.
That's awesome. It's nice to know that you kind of have the compatibility, whether or not you're using Azure Synapse Analytics or Azure Data Factory. Hey, Hyong, people are really excited about this. We had one comment from Athul who says, ADF is a really powerful ETL tool, yet simple GUI to use. Kudos to your team on making it really easy to use.
Thank you. And I think we owe where Azure Data Factory is today, right, to the community as well. Like just about earlier this month, Gartner announced Azure Data Factory as a leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant for data integration. And we could not have done it without the community, without all the customers that has been working with us day in, day out, right? Giving us really honest feedback. And that helps us improve the tool to get it to, to where it is today, but also to meet all your enterprise data integration needs.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's awesome. And it really shows to our customers clearly. Someone also commented that there are lots of updates inside this one. So there are lots of updates, and we're actually going to take a look at some of these updates. Before we get into the demos, is there anything you want to kind of plug or remind users as they go and see all these new things in action?
Yeah, I think every single update that you see today, right, is brought to you by the Azure Data Factory team. And I just want to thank the presenters who have spent countless hours preparing for the demos that you see today. Many of this is demos that you probably have not seen in any kind of event. And we're so glad to be able to showcase it during the Data Expo show with Anna.
Awesome. Yeah, we're really excited. Thanks so much, Hyong. With that being said, let's get right into it. So for this first one, I'm going to bring up Mark Kromer. Hi, Mark. How are you doing?
Hello. I'm great. Thanks.
It's awesome to have you on the show again. I know we've had you on a couple times before, and you always show us some cool stuff. So excited to see what's new and what you're going to show us.
All right. Let me jump right in. I'm going to try to keep this to under 10 minutes here so that we can have time for all the other interesting, exciting updates that we have in Data Factory. We have a lot of folks from the team on the call today and the meeting so that we can talk about these things. So what I'm going to talk about today is the integration of Power Query into Azure Data Factory, which we just announced generally available this week. So Power Query within Data Factory provides you the ability to transform and to prepare your data in a data wrangling sort of mechanism. And so what that means is that we bring the power of Azure Data Factory, which is scaled out data integration, ETL, that Hyong was talking about. We bring that to you as a data engineer through the Data Factory service. With Power Query, Power Query, you've probably used it before inside of Excel or inside of Power BI and those sort of tools, maybe, using it with moving some data for Dataverse and Dynamics and whatnot as well. But it's a very comprehensive tool in terms of data preparation, and it's built within that very common and very comfortable Microsoft Office sort of kind of frame. And so we bring that into ADF to provide you as a sort of a citizen data integrator, the ability to get the power of that scale out, that orchestration, the monitoring, the management, all the goodies built into Data Factory comes with it now when you build your Power Query inside of Data Factory. So let me show you what that looks like. You'll see that on my design surface, I have I'm inside of my factory, my Data Factory, and you'll see a factory resource now, a top level, as being Power Query. So every Power Query that you build will sit there within the Power Query artifacts. So you build artifacts that are Power Queries. So if I click on one of these, let's try this one here. This is my taxi demo. I'll try to have time to build this from scratch for you. This is a pre-baked demo here. I'll try to build this for you in real time to show you how this works if we have time. But they were all sitting here. Now what happens is when you open up the Power Query inside a Data Factory, it's fully embedded, so it's a single design surface for you to work from, a single pane of glass. Now I have the design view turned on, so you can see the full transformation capability inside the Power Query surface inside Data Factory natively as well. And so you can click on each one of these to get the different transformations that were built for it. This is not anything new for Power Query, right? This is Power Query Online, and it's all built using the Power Query technology. You'll see the steps that you have designed here. If you don't want to see the design view, you can turn off the design view. But the other really advantageous thing that's Power Query and data wrangling inside a Data Factory brings to you is the ability to also profile that data. And so if you're a data scientist or if you're looking at data exploration, just performing data exploration, what I like to do is go over to the options inside of the panel with the Power Query embedded and click on global options. And if you click on enable column profiles, it's the default is set to sampling 1,000 rows. You can also change that sampling, but I'll just set it to 1,000 rows, and you'll be able to get stats about your data immediately. So this is all running on inside of Power Query. So sampling is probably the best way to go for your profile stats, but you can see that you get uniqueness out of each column. For example, vendor ID, this is part of my demo, is that vendor ID has just two different values within this taxi data. So if I wanted to do something like what I'm doing in this mashup, this Power Query mashup, is I'm aggregating to find the average trip time based on the different vendors. And so you can find out this information about your data this way. You can look for key column candidates, look for a number of nulls in columns, distinct columns, and all that, distinct values in the columns, and all those sorts of things. So this is all the interactive data exploration working with the data inside of your Power Query. Now, once you have completed this work, so let me go back to the design view for a second. Once you've completed your work, and in my case, what I did was I joined two different data sets. And I should show you, this is a really good point to show you right now. Let me bring up this bottom panel. Remember, that's Power Query embedded inside of ADF, which means that ADF data sets are exposed to you as a developer inside of ADF to bring into your Power Query. So the data sets that define this source data, this tax data, is actually sitting inside of ADLS or Blob Store, and I'm accessing it through just normal Data Factory data sets. So we've married together the two different concepts, the Power Query and ADF, into a single experience, bringing that citizen data integrator persona to be able to work with data and get the benefit of Data Factory. Now, if you've used Power Query in the past, you know that I'm sitting here within an environment where I'm exploring the data and looking at the results. And in fact, let me show you the results. If I go over to my, minimize this bottom panel. If I go over to my group by, the final step in my Power Query here is an aggregation. So inside of Data Factory, when you're building a mapping data flow, we call it an aggregation. The Power Query terminology is grouping. So you set your group by, and then you set your the aggregation that you want to use on that group by. And actually, if I go over here to query settings, I can show you that you can see it in the steps here as well. I like to kind of edit by going into the icon over here to change the configuration. I've grouped by that vendor ID. Remember the vendor ID I saw within the data exploration had just the 2 values. So it makes sense to group by that and to get the average time of the trip time for each trip from those 2 different vendors. When I do that, I end up with just the 2 columns coming out. I get the average time and the vendor. The vendor was the group by, and the average time was the new aggregation that I created. So there's the average trip time for each vendor. So it looks like, VTS is a little bit shorter of a time than it is for CMT. So interesting. Now, what do you do with that? When you're exploring data in your on your laptop or within your Power Query, typically in Power BI, you're going to build a report on that. But ADF is the ETL tool. So the final step, the final mile in this operation is going to be to land that data somewhere. So this is where the power of ADF starts to take over from here. Okay. So let me go over into a pipeline. So what you'll do in a pipeline is you'll have other activities, then you'll add in your Power Query data prep into that so it can execute at scale then, right? So this Power Query is built, generating the M script behind the scenes. So if you click on Advanced Editor, you can see the M script that gets generated from that. To be able to scale that out, we will actually convert that on the fly for you to execute on Spark. And we execute data transformation in ADF on Spark by using what's called the Azure Integration Runtime, which defines the compute type and the size of the computes that you can execute against, which means you can go from anywhere from a small, 2-node cluster up to, 256 cores of compute power at your disposal. And now you can run that from a Power Query as well. So let me actually do this. Let me actually use a different pipeline. Let's go over to this pipeline over here. I'm going to pick up one of the ones that I have already built here in my. We'll use this one here. I called my Power Query activity as taxi PQ. By the way, let me show you how you get this on your design surface. The Power Query I created called my taxi demo will sit here under the Power Query artifacts. So you just drag it onto your design surface. And you can add a Power Query into your pipeline. It will handle all the rest. We'll handle the Spark environment. We will handle the conversion into Spark and all that. So this one I actually ran. I believe I ran this a little bit earlier before we started the session. It took about 2 minutes to execute. When this executes, what happens is now you can serialize that data somewhere. So it's not just data exploration. It's not just sitting in your laptop in the UI. You set a sync. So all the sync capabilities that you've come to enjoy within Data Factory, if you've been a data engineer in Data Factory, light up now inside of Power Query as well. So now I can sync that data to a series of different types of destinations, SQL databases, Parquet, Synapse Analytics. In this case, I'm going to a blob store folder, and I'm defining the name of the file that's going to be output from it. And I can do mapping on that as well. So notice Data Factory is able to detect from your M script, from the Power Query you created, what are going to be the output columns for that. So remember, I took all of those columns coming from the taxi data. Let me show you that again. I just realized because of time, I'm probably not going to be able to build this from scratch. So you're going to have to look at my pre-baked demo today. But all this data that came in had many different columns, many different rows, about 50,000 rows. And then I summarized it to only have the 2 columns and the rows that are needed just to express those averages, which is going to be 2 columns or 2 rows. So it knows that is the output schema you're going to extract from your data, and so you can map that. And then what happens is when you click debug or you click add a trigger to your pipeline, we'll execute that in the background on a Spark cluster. So let me just go ahead and click debug on it, and we'll let that cook. And then I'll show you what the results look like. So I ran it earlier, and by CSV comes out with those exact values that you saw previously on the screen. They get output into into a file. So you can
Nice.
serialize your Power Query output into a file or a database or whatever you like. The last thing I'll show is because this is actually executing using Data Factory, you get monitoring built into it. So you can get, this isn't the one I wanted to click on. I want to go back to this one. You can click on it and you can see the status of your execution. You can also see the progress of it as it is transforming and as it is executing. I'll bring up one that's ran previously. Let's go back to the debug runs and let's go to this one down here. There you go. So what happens is when you actually execute that taxi data Power Query, we convert that, like I said, into Spark and into ADF in the background. So now you can also get details output of what was actually done with that execution. So you can see details of how long every step took within that series of transformations, how much data was calculated, how many partitions were created. The partitions will be created automatically for you because we're executing in a distributed system and on Spark. Okay, this one actually completed in 49 seconds. Let me actually open up this one while I'm talking through it. There you go. This is a better representation. Remember, there were two streams of data. There were two sources that were joined together. So you see the join that was created here. The data was pretty evenly partitioned across two Spark partitions, calculated 500,000 rows. And at the very end, you should see that there were just 2 rows calculated, 2 partitions, and this is how long it took for that data to be written to the file that I showed you. You can even get details of the skewness, kurtosis of the data across the distribution of data, as deep as you want to go. If you are a business analyst working in Power Query, providing your intent to transform data through Power Query and ADF, just stick with the UI. You don't need to get into that detail if you don't want to, but we surface it all for you if it's important to you to be able to performance tune and to work with your data instead of ADF. And I think that's, I think probably at time, so I'll probably stop it there.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mark. We did have one question, if you could quickly answer. This question came in from Reyes. He says, thank you, Mark. What is a timeline to add a support for some of the unsupported IM functions in the Azure Data Factory Power Query?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So that's going to be one of the most popular questions around this, is because what we do is we essentially take the M that is generated from your UI here, and we convert this on the fly into a language Data Factory can execute at scale on Spark. That means that the functions that you see when you are working with transformations, so when you click, the different steps and you add another step and you add a transformation, not every one of these transformations with the functions behind it convert yet into Spark, but that is top of mind, something that we're working very hard to continue to add more to it. You'll get some messages back saying that this one doesn't fold, so you'll want to remove it. You'll see it here in the query settings is the best place to see it, and then you'll have to remove that one and try a different mechanism. We document the things that aren't supported and workarounds for some of those, but we'll continue to burn down that list over the next 6 to 12 months. It's very important for us to do that.
Awesome. That's great to know. And then just one more question, because I want to make sure it's clear to folks. Erwin mentioned that this is running on Spark. Is it Databricks? Is it Synapse? And is this available in Synapse today?
Okay, great question. So there's 2 different, so the same engine is in both ADF and Synapse Analytics. This feature of Power Query for data wrangling is today only available in Data Factory. We're working on ways to surface it in Synapse. It's going to be a slightly different way that we're going to surface Power Query in Synapse. At least we'd like that we intend to. Probably a little bit more tighter integrated. Remember, ADF is a data integration tool, and so the way that you perform things like, let me actually show a pipeline. The way that you do things like add different capabilities like Databricks, for example, into your pipeline is by using an activity that expresses what you intend to do with that. So having Power Query here makes a lot of sense in the pipeline context. Synapse Analytics being a much more sort of broad platform, instead of having a Power Query activity, you're probably going to surface that in a slightly different manner. So give us a little more time on getting that into Synapse Analytics. And then when you run any kind of data flow, because at the end of the day, this turns into a data flow, the Power Query does, an ADF data flow. By the way, real quick, if you execute a Power Query that lands data in Power Platform, that's also a data flow, just a different engine for data flows. Data flow is a common term. But when you do that within ADF, ADF will always execute that against Azure Databricks. If you run that in Synapse Analytics, that runs against Synapse Spark. We're going to eventually conform everything into Synapse Spark, but for now, that's the reality of what the product does today.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mark. It's been really cool to see Power Query and see kind of this familiar tool that a lot of people already know how to use now available in Azure Data Factory. So thanks so much, Mark, and we'll be looking for future updates on that in the future.
Sounds good.
Awesome. So moving right along, hey, we had a bunch of questions, and I just love how engaged you all are. People are saying greetings, love the priorities. People are loving that we love the taxi data. Taxi data set is open, so it's always easy to use data that exists. A couple people commented on a replay. While we stream live, you can watch these whenever you want on our YouTube channel. So you can head over to aka.ms/Azure SQL YT to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and then you get notifications when we do stream live. I know that this time doesn't work for everyone, but maybe this is something we can keep in mind going forward as maybe some sort of alterations of the times that we say. But all that being said, I just want to thank you all for engaging with us. It's really awesome to see all you engage. We're going to keep moving along. We saw Power Query in Azure Data Factory. That was a new announcement exclusive for Data Expose. And now we're going to be talking about managed VNets, which was also a new announcement. And for that, I'm going to bring up Joshuha Owens. Hi, Joshua. How are you?
Hi, Anna. How are you? I'm doing all right.
I'm great, and I'm excited to see this managed VNet thing. You know, I don't know a ton about it, so I'm just going to pass it to you and let you show us how it works.
Sure. Yeah, so as Hyong mentioned earlier, right, we are kind of excited to announce the general availability of managed VNets, right? And kind of before I dive into the demo, just wanted to get a quick 101 of what a VNet is, right? There might be a lot of viewers out there that are still new to Azure and don't know what a virtual network is in Azure. But think of it as a way to kind of segregate your resources in Azure behind networks, right? And in case of Azure, it's a virtual network, right? And typically, customers want to do this because they want to segregate resources from a security perspective inside of that virtual network, right? So imagine you have a storage account or an Azure SQL database. You can actually expose those behind that managed VNet so that the traffic only flows across that virtual network. And then you can block those resources from having internet access so that that traffic stays internal. So what the Azure Data Factory Managed VNet feature does is it allows ADF to talk to those resources inside that VNet without having to have essentially a VM or compute spun up inside of that. So previously, we have another technology called the self-hosted integration runtime that allows you to talk into those networks or on-prem networks, but you had to install a VM and manage that service, and it's still a great product, and people are still going to use that feature. But for those who don't want to manage those VMs, this managed virtual network feature essentially allows that process to be a lot easier.
Awesome. That sounds great. Sounds a lot easier to set up.
It is. It's just a few clicks through our integration runtimes, which I'll show that here in a second. So right now, you'll see here that I have a couple of link services, right? I have an Azure SQL database and a blob. Now, I've firewalled these off from the internet. So right now, somebody on the internet could not get to my blob storage account or Azure SQL database. And so what I'll do to prove that, right, is if I come into here and hit test connection, because I have not set up the VNet, you'll see that the connection has failed, right? ADF does not have a network path to this blob storage account right now. And then the same with my SQL database, Azure SQL database in this case, it has failed, right? So the very first thing you're going to do to set this up is you're going to set up an integration runtime that supports that managed VNet feature. I already have one set up here, but I'll just quickly walk through the kind of setup process here. So you're going to click New, and we're going to come to Azure, and I'm going to select Azure because this is Azure Compute being managed for you. It just kind of spins it up so that it can talk to your VNet. And so you'll see here there's a box for virtual network configuration. Oh, that's the arrow there. But and if you hit Enable, you'll see here that this is what enables that managed VNet option. Now, one important thing I do want to call out is you'll see here that it says Enable Interactive Authoring. Generally, as a developer, you want this checked. This is what's going to allow you while you're developing, if you need to, say, preview data or look at schema information that's inside, say, a file or a table. This allows that compute to spin up during your authoring time to get at those resources in your VNet. Otherwise, you can still design your pipelines and run them, but if you don't have this checked, then you can't kind of use some of those preview or even that test connection functionality. And that takes a few minutes to spin up the first time, right? And then it's kind of available inside of your Azure Data Factory. So I have one already set up. So let's go back and set up the connection. And these are through what's called a private endpoint, right? So again, without getting too much into networking 101 with Azure, a private endpoint is essentially a NIC and an IP address inside of that virtual network that's where that private traffic flows over. And we can set up a connection from ADF to that private endpoint so that traffic flows within that VNet. And there are a couple of ways to set it up. You'll see here at the bottom of the screen, I have manage private endpoints. You can also set it up from the link service itself. Just whichever way you want to do it is fine. So I'll do one of each, right? So I'm going to set up one to my blob storage account, right? So I'm going to pick blob, and I get a ton of subscriptions here. So let me filter them down. And then my blob storage account. So I'm going to create this private endpoint, and let's just call it something like blob private endpoint, and create. Now what this does, it actually sends a request to the owners of the private endpoints for that resource. In this case, it's the storage account. So it just prevents people from just randomly, creating private endpoints to resources. So somebody has to go approve it. They have to be kind of a security admin to be able to approve that this ADF needs to connect to that private endpoint. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my Azure portal. I'll go to my storage account. And with storage, this is under the networking and firewall rules. So if I go to networking here, you'll see here that I have private endpoint connections. And you'll see here I have this pending request. And you'll see here it's that blob PE that I called it. And basically, as the admin of the storage account, I would approve that, right? And you can put whatever message you want here for that approval. Now, it will approve pretty much instantly here. I would say wait about a minute or two before you test anything in ADF for that kind of networking all to get set up. So in the meantime, I'm going to set up the SQL one, right? So I'll do that from the link service. You can see there's kind of two ways to set that up. And so you'll see here on this side, I have the manage private endpoint and create new. And that basically gets you to that same interface. So it's just a preference of what you want to do. And so I'm going to call this AZ SQL PE. And again, I'm going to select my subscription and then my SQL server and create it. Now, very similarly, I have to go approve that, right? So from the SQL server side, right, I'm going to go to my Azure SQL Server, which is here. Now, different products have this at different places, right? So most of the time it's under firewall and virtual networks, but in the case of Azure SQL, there's actually a call out at the top level of security for private endpoint connection. So I'll just say, depending on the product where you go to approve it, it's slightly different. And you'll see I have a pending one here. So I'm going to approve that. And that's all there is to set up the connection piece, right? So now if I come back, and I go to my blob connection and test it. Remember before that this failed. Hopefully that has provisioned.
Moment of truth.
Yep. And sometimes it takes a couple of minutes, right?
Yeah, but this is really cool. I mean, like we've talked a lot on the show about private endpoint for Azure SQL database. So it's cool that, every other service is also starting to kind of support these private endpoint connections. So we can have a private connection through all of our systems and not just with the database, for example.
Yeah, and so while this is provisioning and testing, like what I want to show is also, this is great for obviously services that support private endpoint connections, but because we support a service called Azure Private Link, that actually enables some really advanced scenarios that you can even use this to talk to on-premises resources, right? You could talk to your on-prem SQL Server, for instance, in a copy activity without installing that self-hosted integration runtime. Now, that networking piece is a little bit more complex to set up, but hey, my connection seceded, so this is working now. But there's a GitHub out here, right, that basically walks through the steps of how to set this up. Now, I know this architecture diagram is probably scary for a lot of people, but basically, the gist of it is you have a special forwarding VNet that you set up. You set up the private link service inside of that, and then you connect that forwarding VNet to your on-prem resource or your other cloud provider virtual network, or even another virtual network inside of Azure. It doesn't really matter. That private link service access that bridge to be able to talk to those resources. And this GitHub basically walks through, all the steps of how you create the VNet, how you create the private link service, and so on. And then once you do that, again, setting up an ADF is very similar. You would set up a private link service, managed private endpoint, and then you would set up, your on-prem SQL Server connection. And then from there, you're able to securely connect to your on-prem resources without having to install that self-hosted integration runtime.
Awesome. That's really cool. Thanks so much for showing us this, Joshua. We did get a few questions and comments. One coming in from Twitch, Very Sticky Rice says, is this like Polybase? I would say this is slightly different from Polybase technology, but maybe you have a comment. I think this came up when you were talking about the integration runtime.
Yeah, it is definitely different than Polybase. So our self-hosted integration runtime is kind of similar to the Power BI Data Gateway, right? It's a way to kind of see inside your network. This managed VNet is also similar. It's just you don't have to manage that, right? ADF essentially, as needed, will spin up its own little compute inside of your VNet to, grab a file from your blob storage or read data from a table. So a little different than Polybase in the sense that it's more of a networking technology.
Right. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Joshua. This has been really useful. It's been cool to see. It's awesome to see how easy it is to get this set up, and also kind of the separation of duties where you might have someone go approve for your different private endpoint. But thanks so much, Joshua, and hope to have you on the show again soon.
All right. Thank you.
Awesome. So we're getting a lot of comments and engagement. Again, I just want to encourage you all to keep it coming. Code with Sean says, private endpoint is highly recommended. That is true. So it's nice to hear this kind of extended support through all different ways and even more advanced scenarios like Joshua was mentioning. All right, we're going to move right along. We got a couple more demos for you all. The next one is going to be about a couple different things. And for this, I'm going to bring up Abhishek. Abhishek, hi, how are you?
Hi, Anna. I'm doing good. Hello, everyone.
Awesome. And we're excited to hear you talk about some of the new stuff, including Teams notifications. So I don't know a ton about this, so I'm going to pass to you to tell us more about it and show us.
Absolutely. Yeah. So one of the common problems that we hear from data engineers is ability to notify of certain failures, or even when the pipelines are successful, do things like proactive monitoring. And this is where Teams notifications comes in very handy, and we have made it super simple to kind of make it work end to end. And this is what you need to do. So in this demo, I will quickly set up a Teams notification channel and take you through how this experience works. So there is a prerequisite, of course. We use Teams webhook. So if you're using Microsoft Teams, and if you're aware of it, Microsoft Teams is basically an app which you can find it on mobile devices as well as on desktops. And it can send you notifications even on your mobile devices in case if you want to proactively monitor pipeline informations, pipeline failures or success. Now, that's the advantage of using Teams. So you can create a Teams channel, and you can create basically a webhook in that Teams channel, and you can invoke it using this template that we have in ADF. So if you look into the ADF UI, you can quickly get started with the pipeline templates. Here's template gallery, and search for Teams in here. You can see this send notification to a Teams channel in Microsoft Teams. So you can view the documentation as well, which basically documents step-by-step guide on how to get this working, what are the prerequisites. You can see there are a few things like in Teams, you can go create a new incoming webhook connector against a given channel. Using this webhook connector, ADF will connect to this Teams channel and send the notifications all through this. And once you are able to do that, you can add your custom images. You can do a lot of customizations. I'm going to skip that here. But just and as an example, I uploaded an ADF logo over here so that the notifications kind of holds that ADF UI. Based on your requirements, you can customize these. Once you're done with these prerequisites, let's come back to Data Factory. In the Data Factory side, just click on use this template, and it will create a template for you. Once the template is ready, you can now stitch this template. If you want to go into details, which I will skip here, everything is very well parameterized, like the Teams webhook URL. We just created a Teams webhook URL. We can probably paste it over here once you have done that. So I already did that here in my pipeline, and I just created a failure to happen knowingly so that we can do this demonstration. So my activity is failing here, and I am sending on failure notifications to my Teams channel. And since this is very well parameterized, you can simply call an execute pipeline and call that particular template that we just created as part of Teams notification. And within this, you can parameterize the Teams webhook URL. As part of the prerequisite, you generated a Teams webhook URL, just copy and paste it in here. Once you're done with it, just click on the debug just for testing it out. And what this does is it fires this web activity which fails. It's supposed to fail for the demonstration, so it should fail. And once it fails, it'll trigger the execute pipeline, which will notify using the templates that we used and send a notification on the Teams. And I have my Teams set up over here, so you can see just a few seconds back from the current time, it sent a notification. It sent me a pipeline. As I said, it's very well templatized, and you can actually modify this template to your requirements as well. But what it does with the basic template is it sends you an alert, and you can see it failed, the pipeline status, the run ID. What you can do is you can even jump into the pipeline run. It'll basically open up your ADF UI, not recommended on a mobile device though, but it works. You can run it, open it, and monitor your pipelines on a mobile device as well. So it works. It is very handy, and you can get notified on Teams whenever you need to be. So that's about from the Teams notifications. You see it has been successfully sent. This was the pipeline run ID, which is 1C2. You can match it. It's the same pipeline run ID. So this is the notification that got generated. You can check your notifications. You'll see the notification being generated, and you can view the pipeline run. So that was a quick demo on how you can actually send notifications, interact with Teams channels directly from ADF pipeline.
Awesome.
So
thanks. Yeah, that was really cool so far. I know there's other stuff, but yeah, that's just so cool, and it's great to have it on Teams because me, probably like a lot of other people, are always using Teams, so it's nice to be able to get those notifications there as opposed to having to go fetch for them somewhere else.
Yeah, that's cool. So let's move on to the next topic, which is Vishal mentioned about it. From the dev productivity perspective, many times what happens when you're using Git and different branches is you end up having multiple branches. And at times what happens is some of the development is happening already ahead from what the code has been merged into the main branch. And so the requirement here comes in. For example, my main branch has a few pipelines, and my dev branch might have a few more pipelines because I've been working on a few days on these branches. For example, there's a pipeline 9 dev 1 which is missing in the main branch. So now we added this capability where you can create a new branch from an existing branch. So you can base it on not just main, which was the default earlier, but you can base it on dev 1. And I can say, this is my dev 2 branch, and it basically is based on dev 1. So you can get all the work that you have done in a separate branch into a new branch, and you can start right from there without losing any work or without having this hassle of merging time conflicts, because otherwise, if you recreate those pipelines, you will have a conflict during the merging because those pipelines already exist. So it's a very good way in collaborative, working in a collaborative manner and being able to use each other's branches to kind of base your branch on those. That was my second demo. So I'll move on quickly to the third one before I hand it over to Sunil. The third one is around user-assigned managed identity support. And this is a big thing, especially for an enterprise who's security focused. So we announced today the user assigned managed identity support in Data Factory, which basically means you can use user assigned identity for connecting to any connections or any data stores. Now, what is user assigned managed identity? For people who are new to that, managed identity basically makes life easier for a data engineer because you don't have to provide any credentials, secrets inline while connecting to those data stores. That's what basically at a high level managed identity does. It's kind of a managed identity. It's better than service principal because service principal still requires you to create certain keys, manage certificates, all those things comes in, which is not really a data engineer's job and shouldn't be a data engineer's job. So managed identity ends up solving all those issues. With a user assigned managed identity, the benefit you get is you decouple this identity from a given factory. So the challenge that many customers have, they have hundreds of factories, which has hundreds of identities, unique identities to it. And then they have to grant permissions across hundreds of factories. So operationalizing it can become cumbersome in case of system assigned managed identity. With user assigned managed identity, you can detach this identity from the service, like Data Factory instance, into Active Directory based identity, and then reattach it whenever you need it. So what we are going to demo today is you can bring in a UAMI into ADF and use that for authenticating into different services. So I'll just quickly show you a few screens, how you can do that in Data Factory. From your factory, create a link service. You can go to any link service that you have. Now we have added a new auth mechanism here, user assigned managed identity. You can choose that and you can select credentials. There's a new object called credentials, which basically holds all your UMIs. You can basically create a quick one here. You can see, you can select a UMI. For example, I have a UMI which I can bring and click on create. Even if it's not associated, it lists down all your UMIs and you can choose one of them and click on create. That's how easy it is to get started with UMI, and still you don't have to add any credentials in your link services. Your link services definitions does not need to contain any credentials. So that's the benefit you get with UMI, and that's all that I had the demo.
Awesome. Thanks, Abhishek. There were so many things in there. Teams notifications, branching off of existing branches, and now user-assigned managed identities. So many announcements in this episode. Very exciting. So thanks so much, Abhishek. Awesome. Okay, so believe it or not, we still have more demos for you all. For our final demo of the day, I'm going to bring up Sunil to talk about the additional announcement that we have not talked about yet. So hi, Sunil. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Anna. And hello, everybody.
Awesome. We are happy to have you here. And I'm just going to pass it over to you. I know you're going to be talking about TTL, but you might want to give us a refresher on what that stands for before you get into it.
Yes. Thank you, Anna. Yes. As Hyong, said in the beginning, right, we have announcement around TTL, and TTL is a time to live. Right, and this feature was available with Azure Data Factory, and now it's available with Synapse Analytics. Right. So for those who may not know much, so what I want to do is I want to quickly go through for a couple of minutes. Right. So what is TTL? Right. So TTL is basically, if TTL is set 0, which is by default, right, ADF or Synapse pipeline will always spawn a new Spark cluster environment, for every data flow activity. Right. So if you have a sequence of data flow activities, so for every data flow activity, it will spin up a new Spark cluster, and as you know, right, the initialization takes 3, 4, 5 minutes. Okay, but if you set a DTL, right, ADF will maintain a pool of VMs, for duration of TTL. So that's the essence. Okay, and then how you set it up, so the way you set up TTL is you create a new integration runtime. That's where you assign your TTL, right? You can say 15 minutes, 30 minutes. So for that many minutes, right, we'll keep those VMs, those Spark VMs, alive. Okay. So this is what it is. So we'll keep it alive, for those TTL minutes. And in that case, what will happen is, your subsequent data flow activity will reuse that warm Spark cluster. That way, you will get total reduction, in execution of your ADF or Synapse pipeline. Okay. So now let's go to a demo. Okay. So as you can see here, right? So suppose I want to assign a TTL in 30 minutes, right? So I go to here, like here my integration runtime, right? I'll create a new integration runtime. This is a Azure style, right? I go to continue here, and then I can call whatever I want, right? And it's because this is a data flow related, right? And you can see I can give, whatever minutes I want, right? I have 5 minutes. I have, I've 5 minutes. I can have, I cannot see here, right? So yeah, up to 30 minutes I can have. Okay, so this is the way you set up. But for this demo session, I have actually already created this Synapse TTL. You can see this. I have a TTL time to leave of 30 minutes. Okay, that's what I have. Now let's see it in action. Okay, so as Hyong said, right, this is applicable for both ADF and Synapse pipeline. And as you know, we are feature wise pretty compatible. So I want to show you the same feature with Synapse, right? So here you can see pipeline 1, right? It is one data flow 2, right? You can see how I set it up here, right? So here I go to the data flow, right? Data flow 2. Right, sorry. Let me go to pipeline 1, right? So here you see settings, right? So here you see, here I'm running that on Synapse TTL. That's my integration runtime with 30 minutes. Okay, so this is my data flow 2. So this is it's my single data flow activity. But just for this demo, I have created a TTL demo. It's another pipeline where I've chained the same data flow activities, 3 times. Okay, this is the first one, second one, third one. So as the TTL principle allows, right? So it should reuse the same one cluster as it switches from this activity to this activity to this activity. So you should get net reduction in your total pipeline execution. Okay, so just to give it a spin, right? Why don't we do one thing, right? So here is my single data flow activity pipeline. I will do a trigger, right? Let me trigger it. Trigger now. Okay, now I'll go to my monitor here. So you can see, so this is just started, right? As you can see, right, I'll give you like previously before today morning, I could run my pipeline 1 in like 1.37 minutes, but my TTL demo, which is the same data flow activities chain, takes only 4 minutes 47 seconds. So basically 0 startup time between activity to activity. If you don't use TTL 30 minutes, you can add like 3 to 4 minutes to it, right? So it could be around 10 minutes. Okay, so anyway, we will see that here. Okay, yeah, so let's wait. So it should finish around 1.36. Okay.
Okay, so what we're doing here while it's going, just so I understand, is instead of having to like spin up this compute, which takes time every single time, if we know a data flow is going to need like multiple sets of compute, or it will need compute, or maybe you're going to run multiple flows around the same time, you can set a longer time to live so that you don't have to go through this spin up process. Is that kind of how it works?
Exactly, Anna. Yeah, that's what it is. So if you have a sequential data flow activities, right, as Hyong said, right, so we keep this Spark cluster in a maintained state, right? So you don't waste time, in spin up time of the new clusters for new activities. Okay. Yeah.
Awesome. That makes sense. We did get one more question from Learn TV. They said, is TTL also something we can set up in a self-hosted integration runtime?
No, this is for the data flow activities. Okay, so this is exclusively applies to data flow. Okay, yeah,
got it.
Yeah, so so you saw, right, it's 1 minute 30 seconds, right, just per spin, right? Why don't we do TTL demo, right? Let's do add trigger again, right? And so we'll see it in action. Okay. And now, so this is 1.37, 1 minute 37, 37 seconds, right? So ideally it should be around, say again, right, around 4.47, right? Okay. This is like, sequential activities running in parallel. Okay. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Cool. Very cool. Let's see. I think while we're waiting, because we're thinking this will take a couple minutes. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
While we're waiting for this to load, we did get a few questions. I don't want to put you on the spot, but maybe you'll be able to help some of our users answer them. Are you down to try to answer some of these questions?
Sure.
Okay. So one question that we got earlier in the show was, what options are available for auto ingestion of data into Azure Data Factory? Is it possible to schedule a periodic data refresh?
Yes, I think that question is answered by Hyong. I saw that. So yes, we have a triggering mechanism. We have a schedule trigger. We have a tumbling windows trigger, and we have a storage event trigger. Like anytime there is a new file arrives, you can trigger a pipeline. And most recently, we also release something called event trigger, like custom event trigger. You can listen to any event and trigger the pipeline. What it means is, trigger the pipeline means, you tell, that there's some data arrived, file arrived, you start your pipeline, right? And on top of that, right, we also have, we're letting a lot more features. Like recently, something in private preview, we also can, read like the change feed from Cosmos DB, straight into data flow and do the transformations and load to whatever data warehouse, like Synapse, you want, right? So we're constantly working on auto ingestion mechanisms. Okay. Yeah.
Awesome. Great. And let's just check on that. We're still expecting it to run, right? Because it should be running, we're thinking 4 minutes or so, because it's running all of those things in parallel.
Yeah, parallel. So this will finish. Yes. Any more questions? Yeah.
Yes, there is one more question that came earlier in the show from Learn TV. They say, I copy large amounts of data from an on-premises, I'm guessing SQL Server, to Azure SQL using the integration runtime pool. This usually ends up as the bottleneck in my ETL process. How do I maximize the throughput of an integration runtime?
Here, I mean, they're using self-hosted integration runtime, right? They're using that. So yes, so I don't know if they've scaled up to 4 nodes. So you can scale SHR into 4 nodes, and you can really optimize, right, your settings on your DIU, so like SHIR, to get the maximum performance, right? We have seen customers moving. In fact, I was with a couple of customers last month, like millions of rows, right, in 2 to 3 hours using just single node SHIR. It all comes down to how you are setting your copy parameter, and how's your copy configuration parameters, right? And then what's your SHR configuration parameters, right? But over 2 to 3 years, right, our engineering has figured out a method called, we have something called DIU, data integration unit, which is basically a representation of amount of CPU, amount of memory, amount of network. In fact, automatically we set that DIU power so that you don't have to tweak anything, right? It's pretty much automated. But still, if you want to get performance, you could scale, you could scale using up to 4 nodes. Okay. And yeah.
Gotcha. Awesome. Hopefully that helps answer all of our folks' questions. We've had so many questions throughout the show. So thank you all for your questions. Let's take a look back at this. It looks like it's still running, but hopefully it will complete soon.
It will finish.
Maybe while we're waiting for it to finish completing, I think we've seen in history that it will complete. I'm going to bring up everyone else, and we'll just see if we have any more questions. One question that we had when you mentioned DIU, they said maybe they're a little confused between DIU and DTUs for Azure SQL Database. I don't know. Actually, I don't know a ton about DIU, so I'm not sure how those compare.
Yeah, so DIU is a term specifically, used, for our ADF copy. So DIU is a, kind of, you can say like it is a course and the memory, compute, right? So when you start a copy job, right, we say, okay, how many DIU units you want, right? And so that's kind of scaling of your copy job, right? But most of the time, if you look at documentation, looking at your source and destination, we kind of automatically, tune that DIU. You don't tweak it, right? But to get sometimes the performance, right, you might increase up. So DIU is pretty much specific to, ADF copy. But DTU, as you know, is a SQL Server. It's a data throughput, right? It's a SQL Server centric, terminology. But so both are different. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sunil. This has been really useful. I'm going to bring everyone else back on. Just thank you all for...
Anna is finished, okay?
Oh, it did finish. All right, let's take a quick look.
Yeah.
So it has finished early. As we wrap, I just want to thank all of you for joining us today. We've had jam-packed announcements. I don't think we've ever made so many announcements in a Data Exposed Live episode before. So it's an awesome pleasure to have the Data Factory team on today. Thank you so much for joining us. If you like this video, go ahead, give it a like, leave us a comment, check out this link below on staying up to date on what's new in Azure Data Factory. And we hope to see you next time on Data Exposed.
Thank you.